Welcome to the Say Your Peace podcast, brought to you by the Peace Development Fund. We're a nonprofit and grant-making institution working in the social justice sphere.
My name is Ian, and today my co-host Sophia and I will bring you stories, insights, and a deep dive into social justice issues. We'll be talking to Natalia about divestment on college campuses and mobilization strategies. This is something the Peace Development Fund has a long history of working on, going back to the 1980s.
I'd like to introduce our first guest, Natalia, who's a passionate college student and a member of the University of Massachusetts Dissenters, which is an anti-war collective dedicated to challenging militarization on campus. The group is also a proud grantee of the Peace Development Fund. Well, Natalia, thanks for being here. So, Natalia, can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Word. My name is Natalia. I use they, them pronouns. I am a recent graduate of UMass Amherst with a degree in natural resources conservation. I came about that route in a pretty roundabout way. I initially went to college in anthropology and then later political science. I was planning on going a very activist route with my professional career. And after taking some time off from school during the pandemic, I became much more interested in the natural world and the environmentalist movement. And that was a lot of through working on farms, volunteering in the area, engaging in food justice work. So I decided to return to UMass in 2022 to finish my degree in natural resources conservation, which was a very big switchover. But I have just graduated and I'm very happy about that. Thank you. Thank you. It's pretty exciting. And throughout that time, I've been involved in a good amount of campus organizing that I think is very, very interconnected.
Yeah, again, thanks, Natalia, for being with us today. Again, can you tell us a bit about how you became involved with campus dissenters and their goals?
Yeah, dissenters specifically, I became involved with after October 25th, which was, as you may know, there was a big sit-in that was organized by a coalition of groups, including dissenters and Students for Justice in Palestine. This group, a group of students occupied Whitmore Hall, the administrative building on campus. 57 were arrested, including one staff member, and that was the beginning of my journey with dissenters. Now, I should say that in my previous time at UMass, before taking time off, I was very heavily involved with Students for Justice in Palestine. When I came back, October 25th happened, the Whitmore sit-in happened. I became really interested in the mission of dissenters, which was tackling anti-militarism on a broader scale. And I really aligned with their goals and their tactics, ranging from civil disobedience to public education. I read through the National Dissenters' values. They have a set of 10 sort of core values. I really aligned with those, and that sort of kickstarted my involvement in dissenters.
So I know that UMass, along with a number of other colleges, has made national news for their student protests and encampments. Particularly at UMass Amherst, there was an event that happened on May 7th. Can you talk about your experience on that day?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in response to a national wave of encampments that have popped up across the country on college campuses calling for university divestment from the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The organizers of our encampment, it was a very broad coalition. So it consisted of dissenters, it consisted of Students for Justice in Palestine, our Faculty for Justice in Palestine coalition, a lot of broader Western Mass community groups, including Decarcerate Western Mass Code Pink, and a number of unaffiliated community members who showed up in really, really big and significant ways. There was a plan in place for people who were quote unquote running red, which is referring to sort of refusing to dismantle the encampment at the threat of police arrest. Now, this is a decision that was made as a collective because we felt that the most effective way to sort of bring voice to our movement was to have a presence and to essentially refuse to move. And this is something that has happened at UMass before. In fact, last year, there was a similar encampment that was protesting the housing crisis that is ongoing at UMass. And it lasted 2 whole nights, and there was absolutely no police encounter or threat of police arrest whatsoever. Now, this one, the students received multiple threats from the university admin saying, take this down or we will bring in the police. So what ended up happening was a couple of student liaisons had a negotiation meeting with the chancellor and a couple of administrative people. And while those negotiations were happening, the chancellor was massing police on the campus, which was very obviously a negotiation in bad faith. So my recollection of it was I went home for a little while, and when I returned, it was a completely different scene than the one that I had left a couple hours earlier. A couple hours earlier, it was the energy was really positive. There was food for everyone. There were medics on site. Everyone was asking each other if they had enough water because it was a really hot day out. There were teach-ins, there were speakers, there was chanting. It was just a really positive community building event. And when I came back, it was absolute mayhem. I counted dozens and dozens and dozens of police in riot gear, and that includes the UMass Police Department, the Amherst Police, and the state police that had all been called within about 7 hours of the encampment being set up. And what they did, so I was with the crowd of people who didn't have the intention of getting arrested, but who were there to bear witness to whatever happened. And what the police did was that they set up a line and in front of the bystanding group and pushed us further and further and further back from the encampment itself so that we weren't able to see what was happening inside. So every couple of minutes, they would push us back 5 feet, and a few minutes later, they'd push us back another 5 feet. But I could see about 50 yards away what they were doing inside. And what they were doing inside is every couple of minutes, they would send a squad, just grab a couple of people who were inside, shoving them to the ground a lot of the times, handcuffing them, and taking them away. Now, what happened to a lot of the people, since there were so many people arrested, and I want to clarify that the number that got arrested was way, way higher than was anticipated because the police started rushing the crowd. So the jail support team, which I was a part of, was expecting around between 40 and 60 arrests tops. And the final number was something around 135. I don't even know the final number because we were scrambling to get everybody's contact information. We were scrambling to make sure we knew where everybody was, that everybody was safe and accounted for so that we could give them the proper care after they were released. So it was a way, way higher number than expected. And it was absolute mayhem in the jail support team. There was a point where a majority of people had been arrested and the crowd started to dwindle down. And at that point, I drove to the UMass Police Department where people were starting to get released who had been arrested a few hours prior. And so I was pretty much stationed there with a bunch of other people ready to drive people home, give them food and give them water, anything that they needed after a particularly traumatic experience had happened to them. And I think the thing that I did that felt the most significant was I was at the jail, and at around 2 a.m, I saw a bunch of trucks go by that were carrying people's stuff from the encampment. I just saw it drive by, and I said, okay, that's a little weird. And so me and 5 other people walked down the road after those trucks, and then we found ourselves at the waste processing facility at UMass, where they had taken every single item from the encampment and put it in a dumpster. So me and 5 other people dug out probably 7 or 8 backpacks, people's school backpacks, with the straps cut off because they were cut off of their bodies as they were being arrested. They had laptops inside, they had iPads inside, all of their school stuff was in there. And it was sitting in a dumpster along with tents and food and books and medical supplies. All of it was just going to be thrown away, artwork, banners, stuff like that. And so I dug out as much as I could, but I couldn't get all of it. We couldn't get all of it. And that to me really stood out to me in just sort of the callousness and the lack of care, the lack of community that the culture that the police perpetuate. And they really just threw everybody's stuff away. And if it weren't for the small group of people who noticed those trucks go by, they may have lost thousands and thousands of dollars worth of things that they need in order to be a student. That was like the most significant part of the night for me.
Wow, Natalia, your story is really, it's sobering and empowering at the same time. And I mean, it really highlights how the First Amendment is under attack. So in light of the May 7th events, how would you say these protests have influenced the narrative and discussions on campus about the conflict? Do you see more open debates or entrenched polarization?
I see a lot of conversation happening around this. The encampment and the insane response from the administration has prompted a ton of dialogue on campus, to the extent that people who I initially thought were not really tuned in to everything happening in Palestine are now suddenly like taking an interest because, well, here are their peers and their students who were willing to put their bodies on the line to bring attention to something that's really important to them. And that really we're all involved in as students. We're all in some ways like contributing to the systems and the institutions that are doing harm in Palestine right now. In terms of polarization, I think polarization is always a result of putting pressure on the elite. I think that's always the case. And, you know, think about it. Did the civil rights movement create polarization? Absolutely. But was it like necessary pressure? Absolutely. So I think what has come as a result is a much greater awareness across campus about what's happening in Palestine, and also a greater awareness that our campus leaders are not really aligned with our values. And it makes one kind of question, you know, well, what is it that they're trying to protect? And I think a lot more people are asking themselves that question. What is it that our leadership stands for? Why is it that our leadership made the decision to invoke the police at the risk of potentially killing a student? You know, in the faculty senate meeting, a faculty asked the question to our chancellor, Ruiz, did your administration prepare a statement in case a student was killed? And he didn't have an answer for that. You know, he said no. But that's a very real question, and it makes one wonder, as a lot of the students have started wondering, you know, what type of leadership makes those kinds of decisions and who's influencing those decisions. So there's a ton of conversation happening on campus and a ton of solidarity between the campus groups and organizations that have come as a result. Over 24 student orgs, probably closer to 36 at this point, student organizations ranging from cultural groups to an a cappella group to the UMass Lettuce Club, have released statements in support of the student protesters and against the oppressive administrative response. So we've seen vocal input from groups that we never would have expected support from, and that's happening. So I'm really excited for next year because I think people are going to hit the ground running.
So how do you see UMass dissenters in the future continuing to hold those in power accountable?
I think it comes a lot with outreach and building public awareness. That's something we really need to keep pushing for next year, especially because a lot of the people who we're trying to reach, who are the students in STEM, specifically engineering and computer science, oftentimes aren't exposed to these types of viewpoints. And to a degree, there's targeting the workforce, which is like the students saying, hey, there are other options out there. Come join our Dissenters STEM caucus if you would like to learn more about that. We started a STEM caucus this year to specifically focus on that. And, you know, something I would love to see more of is like, let's hit them where the money is. We are a really, really large group of students that has the potential to create a certain degree of financial stress on the university in various ways. But, you know, we have to build up to that point. So I see next year being a lot of outreach and public awareness. I would really love to see dissenters do more coalition building with the outside community. I think we really started to see that happen with the encampment, but that has to be, those partnerships have to be sustained. And I do think that because UMass is a public university and it's the only public university of the 5 colleges, they're accountable to a much wider group of people than, say, Smith, who, as a private institution, there really isn't anyone holding them accountable, and that's the structure of the private institution. But with a college that's funded by the taxpayers, there is a really strong incentive for us to build more community involvement, especially in the immediate area. So we have to do more of that.
So my last question for you today is, what advice would you give to young people who are passionate and want to get involved but aren't sure how to?
Ooh, I love this question. First thing I would say is center your work on your values and your principles. The fact that you are interested in being involved means that you care. And that, for a lot of people, is the biggest hurdle. And now that you've identified that, I think it's really important to identify what are your specific values and your principles, what makes a positive organizing space for you, and what maybe makes a negative organizing space for you. I think it's also important to identify your skills, identify what you're good at. There's this image of organizing that it's this very kind of guns blazing confrontations with the cops like all the time. And the reality is that a majority of the work is building community and building sustainability, or at least that's how I believe that it should go. Building community and those types of things require a lot of creativity and happen in ways that you may not expect. You know, if you're someone who is not maybe trying to have those crazy confrontational interactions with the police, but you still want to support the people who maybe are doing that work, you know, bring them food, host an art build, you know, have a dance party. Like, there are so many ways, and creativity is so essential in building longevity in movements. So I think that's really important to understand that there's so much value in what may seem like mundane tasks or mundane activities. It's sustaining the movement. I sort of think about it like the other day where someone said that organizing is sort of like a choir holding the same note. And when someone runs out of breath, they drop out, but you don't really notice it because the rest of the choir is supporting them. And so then they can come back in. And that is like the reality of what it's like. I think the biggest problem for new organizers is burnout. And that happens when people take on too much for the wrong reasons and they don't have the support network to be able to sustain them. And so I guess that brings me to my last point, which is that I think the most important part of getting involved in organizing is do it with people you trust. Community really is everything. This work is so difficult. It's like some of the most emotionally challenging work that you will ever do in your life. And you are not able to do it unless you're surrounded by love. That is quintessential. If you're holding that paramount, you will have the energy to continue doing this for the long run, because that's the thing. We need you for the long run. It's so much more effective to take on what you can and, you know, be a supportive force for the long term than to go in guns blazing and burn out, you know, after a semester or after 5 months. Find community, know your values, really know them, take time to think with them, because then what you'll realize is that everything you do is centered around those values.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Natalia. Where can our listeners learn more about UMass Dissenters and all your great work?
Yeah, you can follow us on Instagram at UMass Dissenters. We also have an email list, and to join that, you can shoot us an email, which is umassdissenters@gmail.com. And we'll be updating, probably not so much throughout the summer, as we're stratified and not nearly as active, but next year, you know, we'll be hitting the ground running, and we would love to work with anybody who's interested and keep people updated, especially within the community.